It was October, and the trees in the small New England town had shed most of their leaves, leaving skeletal branches that reached like claws toward the darkening sky. As dusk settled in, shadows danced across the narrow streets and crept up the sides of the old colonial houses that lined the main road. The air held a chill that wasn't entirely due to the cold. Something strange was happening this October. Everyone in town could feel it. It was subtle at first, but the undercurrent of unease had grown stronger by the day. One evening, a group of friends, Emma, Noah, Jess, and Lucas, gathered to swap ghost stories and share a few cheap scares. They didn't believe in the paranormal, but they were drawn to the thrill of the unknown. They chose a secluded spot in the woods, a small clearing just past the old cemetery that dated back to the 1700s. The town's history was riddled with tales of strange disappearances, curses, and warnings of a hidden evil that lay dormant beneath the soil. As they told their stories, they laughed, shrugged off the goosebumps, and ignored the feeling of being watched from the depths of the woods. But that night, something changed. As Lucas started to recount the story of the Watcher, a local legend about a restless spirit who roamed the town looking for new souls to claim, their flashlights began to flicker. The air grew thick, and a strange hum filled the silence. Then, out of nowhere, they heard it, a soft whisper, just on the edge of hearing. It was faint, like the wind, but unmistakable. "Leave." The friends looked at each other, nerves finally starting to creep in. Jess, the skeptic of the group, laughed nervously, dismissing it as some kind of prank. "Maybe it's just the wind," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. They decided to head back, their laughter and bravado fading with every step. But as they walked, they noticed something odd. The trees seemed to be closing in around them, and the path they had followed so easily to get there seemed to stretch endlessly, looping back on itself. The cemetery, which should have been visible just a few paces away, had disappeared. Panic set in as they tried to find their way out. The woods, once familiar, now felt hostile, as if the very earth wanted them to stay. Strange shadows flickered between the trees, moving too quickly to be animals, and every now and then they would hear footsteps echoing their own. Noah pulled out his phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Frustration turned to fear as they realized they were trapped with no idea how to escape. Hours seemed to pass, and in their desperation, they stumbled upon an old, decrepit cabin hidden in the thickest part of the forest. Its windows were broken, and the wood was rotting, but the friends were exhausted and had nowhere else to go. They entered, hoping to find shelter, a phone, anything. But the inside was worse than they could have imagined. Symbols were carved into the walls, strange, twisting runes that seemed to shift if you looked at them for too long. A smell, thick and metallic, hung in the air. Then, as they moved deeper into the cabin, they saw it, a tattered book lying open on a table in the center of the room. The pages were yellowed and brittle, covered in scrawled handwriting and disturbing sketches. It was a journal, and as they skimmed through it, they realized it belonged to a man who once lived in their town. The entries grew more frantic as they progressed, detailing dark rituals and strange voices calling to him from the woods. The final entry was scrawled with the same chilling words they had heard in the clearing: "Leave." A sense of dread washed over them as they realized the man had been trapped, just like them, lured by the same twisted force. The journal described how he had tried to escape, how he had heard his own name whispered in the dead of night, and how he had seen faces, pale and hollow-eyed, watching him from the darkness. He believed he was cursed, and the only way to end it was to perform a final ritual, one that required him to pass the curse to new souls who would wander into the woods seeking thrills in October. Suddenly, a loud bang shattered the silence. The friends froze, hearts pounding. Footsteps echoed through the cabin, heavy and deliberate. They had nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. The door creaked open, and the shadow of a tall, thin figure filled the doorway. Its face was hidden, but they could feel its gaze, cold and unyielding. One by one, the lights in the cabin began to dim until only a faint, eerie glow remained. They tried to scream, but no sound escaped their throats. The figure raised a hand, pointing at each of them in turn, as though claiming them. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The cabin was empty, silent, as though nothing had ever happened. The friends staggered outside, gasping for air, and found themselves back on the familiar path leading to the cemetery. They ran all the way back to town, not stopping until they reached the lights of the main road. No one believed their story. But that October, the woods grew silent. People said it felt different, empty, as if something had been taken from it, or perhaps something had been set free. The town of Ashfield had always seemed a little too quiet. It was nestled between rolling hills and thick forests, isolated enough that most of its residents hardly ever left. Most called it peaceful, but the locals knew the truth. It was a place with secrets. This October, something was waking up. It began with an old man named Walter, who had lived alone in a crumbling house at the edge of the woods. One morning, he vanished. His front door was left wide open, and the only clue was a thin trail of dirt leading from his house into the forest. People assumed he'd wandered off in the night and gotten lost, but a few of the older residents exchanged worried looks. They knew what they weren't supposed to talk about, the stories of the October Man. The October Man was an old myth in Ashfield, something whispered to scare children, but which had roots buried deep in the town's history. The stories said he was a figure that appeared once a year, always in October, to claim the lives of those who dared to walk the woods at night. He had no face, only a dark void where his features should have been, and his long, spindly limbs could reach around trees like tendrils, pulling people in without a sound. Most people dismissed it as nonsense, but over the years, people had gone missing. Some were never found, and those who had been discovered were changed. Alive, yes, but with blank, lifeless eyes, never speaking again. Days after Walter's disappearance, a young girl named Sophie went missing. She had been walking home from school, cutting through the woods as usual, but she never came out the other side. Her mother searched for her, frantic, calling out into the trees until her voice was hoarse. But there was no answer, only an oppressive silence that seemed to hang heavy over the town. The police combed the forest, finding nothing except one small shoe near an old abandoned well. The well had been dry for decades, but some said it had once been used to hide terrible secrets. The townspeople grew uneasy, shutting their windows early and avoiding the woods altogether. They tried not to talk about the disappearances, hoping that by ignoring them, the horror would go away. But then there were the scratches. One night, Jess, a teenage girl, heard a strange scratching sound at her window. At first, she thought it was a tree branch in the wind, but when she looked out, she saw a dark figure standing in the yard, just at the edge of the faint streetlight. The figure had no face, just a dark void where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. It was motionless, yet somehow it felt like it was watching her, seeing through her in a way that made her blood run cold. Jess's parents didn't believe her, but her younger brother did. A few nights later, he swore he saw something moving outside, a shadow that seemed to stretch impossibly long, slithering along the ground like smoke. By then, the townspeople had stopped going out at night, and the few who did ventured only in groups, armed with flashlights and anything that could be used as a weapon. The woods themselves seemed to change, too. People who had lived in Ashfield all their lives began noticing new paths that twisted and looped in impossible ways, leading deeper and deeper into the forest until they opened onto the well. A place that should have been silent was now filled with whispers, like voices just out of reach, calling people's names softly, luring them toward the trees. The night before Halloween, another person disappeared. This time, it was a local police officer, Ben, who had been investigating the disappearances. He'd told his wife he was going to look into the rumors himself, determined to find a logical explanation. But he never came back. The only thing they found of him was his flashlight, dropped and flickering near the well, with claw-like scratches carved into the ground around it. On Halloween night, Jess and her friends made a pact. They couldn't let the fear consume them, they said, and they weren't going to let some story keep them prisoner in their own town. They decided to confront the October Man, if he even existed. Just after midnight, they gathered by the forest edge, holding hands tightly and shining their flashlights into the darkness. The air was cold, filled with the smell of wet earth and rotting leaves. They walked in silence, barely daring to breathe, as they followed the dirt path winding toward the old well. Every step seemed to echo through the stillness. As they neared the well, Jess saw something moving in the shadows. a tall, thin figure with limbs that stretched far too long to be human. Her friends gasped and one started to turn back, but Jess held tight, determined to see it through. The figure drew closer, and they could see it more clearly. Its face, or lack thereof, was an empty blackness, a void that seemed to absorb the light around it. And then, without warning, the ground beneath them seemed to shift. The trees stretched higher, their branches twisting, clawing toward them. They were trapped. The creature took another step forward, extending one impossibly long arm in their direction. In that moment, Jess heard it. Whispered voices, so many of them, speaking in unison. They were calling her name, soft and insistent. Jess! Jess! The other voices joined in, calling her friends' names too, urging them closer to the well, closer to the thing that waited for them. Jess screamed, snapping her friends out of their frozen terror. They turned and ran, branches slashing at their arms and faces as they tore through the woods. The whispers followed them, growing louder and louder, until they finally broke free of the trees, collapsing on the road, gasping for breath. They looked back, but the woods were still, empty, silent. In the days that followed, Jess noticed something strange. Every night, her window would be open, though she was sure she'd closed it before going to bed. Little piles of dirt appeared in her room, and once she found an old, crumbling note on her bedside table, written in a handwriting that wasn't hers. It read simply, "He's watching." Jess tried to ignore it, tried to act as though nothing was wrong, but each night the whispers grew louder. And though she never went near the woods again, every time she closed her eyes, she saw the October man standing just outside her window, waiting for her. Ashfield grew quiet again after that, with fewer and fewer people daring to walk the streets after dark. But every October, just as the leaves began to fall, people could still hear the faint sound of footsteps in the woods. And if you listened closely, you could hear whispers, calling each new soul, luring them toward the shadows where the October man waited, patient as ever. The small, secluded town of Ravens Hollow sat nestled between rugged cliffs and endless forests, largely untouched by the modern world. It was the kind of place that felt forgotten, as if time itself had given up on it. For as long as anyone could remember, Ravens Hollow had one rule that everyone followed. Never open your doors after midnight, no matter what you hear. The legend of the Raven Caller was as old as the town itself. Some said he was a ghost, others a demon, but the stories all shared one thing in common. He came only in October, and he called from the darkness, begging to be let inside. The older residents would speak of people who hadn't believed, people who had ignored the rule. Each time, they would stop short, glancing over their shoulders as if the mere mention of the Raven Caller could bring him back. But Jack, new to Ravens Hollow, thought the legend was ridiculous. He'd moved to the town only recently, after inheriting his late uncle's old weathered house near the edge of town. He had always been a skeptic, and he didn't believe in ghosts, curses, or anything supernatural. Still, the townsfolk insisted he follow the rule. "Listen to us, son," warned his neighbor, Mrs. Carlyle, her voice shaking with age. "The Raven Caller is real. You hear him, you ignore him, you do not let him in." Jack laughed it off, humoring her with a nod and a promise he didn't intend to keep. That night, he settled into his new home, the thick October fog blanketing the town as the wind whistled against his windows. Around midnight, the house felt silent and unsettling, the old wooden floors creaking despite the stillness. Jack checked the time and chuckled to himself, thinking of Mrs. Carlyle's warning. But as the clock struck midnight, a faint sound broke the quiet. A voice. Just a whisper at first, drifting through the dark. "Jack, Jack," he froze, listening. The voice was faint but persistent, growing louder as it echoed through the night. "Jack, let me in." Jack's heart pounded, but he convinced himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him. "It's a prank," he muttered, or maybe a lost drunk. He closed his eyes, trying to ignore the whisper that seemed to creep through the walls. But the voice grew louder, a soft, pleading tone that filled the room like a mist. "Jack, please. It's so cold. Let me in." Jack clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm, but he couldn't shake the growing sense of dread that was clawing at him. He wanted to ignore it, but the voice was relentless, hauntingly sad as though it belonged to someone desperate and alone. He felt a pang of guilt. What if someone really was lost and needed help? "Jack, please, open the door." He shook his head, mumbling to himself, "It's just a voice. It's just a trick." But as he sat there, the voice became quieter, softer, like a child's whisper. He found himself drawn to it, compelled by the sadness, by the sheer desperation in that voice. Before he knew what he was doing, Jack was standing by the door, his hand on the cold metal handle. The voice grew clearer, as if the person were standing right outside. "Let me in, Jack. Just open the door." He felt his hand turn the lock, his fingers trembling as he grasped the doorknob. As he twisted it open, a sudden gust of icy air swept into the room, extinguishing the warmth. But no one was there. Just darkness and fog. Jack stood there, staring into the blackness, feeling a chill run down his spine. He took a step back, closing the door and locking it again. But as he turned, he saw something out of the corner of his eye, a shadow moving across the room. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but then it began to shift and grow, stretching across the walls and ceiling, taking the form of a tall, thin figure cloaked in shadow. The figure's face was hidden in darkness, but its eyes shone like two dull, glowing embers. Jack felt his breath hitch, his pulse racing as he backed away slowly, his eyes fixed on the figure that stood unmoving in the corner. The shadow figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Jack stumbled back, his hands fumbling for anything to defend himself. The figure's voice echoed through the room, low and cold, sounding both distant and disturbingly close. "Thank you, Jack, for letting me in." Jack's heart pounded in terror as he felt an icy hand brush against his shoulder. He bolted for the door, flinging it open and running into the night, not stopping until he reached the town square. There, he collapsed, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of what he'd just seen. By morning, he returned to his house, hoping the terror of the night before had been nothing more than a nightmare. But when he stepped inside, the air was thick with the stench of decay. Dark stains marked the walls, smeared in long streaks leading down the hall toward the living room. And in the corner, where he'd seen the figure, there was a message scratched into the paint, jagged and deep, as though carved with nails. It read, "I am always here. You invited me." Jack moved out of Raven's Hollow the next day, but he was never able to escape the voice. Every October, without fail, he would hear the whisper, soft and pleading, always at midnight. No matter where he moved, no matter how far he ran, the Raven caller found him. And every time he heard the whisper, it grew louder, more insistent, as though it were growing closer. And each October, his only choice was to sit in the dark, desperately covering his ears, praying the voice wouldn't finally break through. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had invited something in. And one day, the door would open again. Deep in the pine-covered mountains of Ashwood stood an abandoned summer camp, long forgotten and left to decay. Camp Hollow Pines had closed decades ago, and though no one spoke of it, everyone knew why. One summer, years ago, something happened. Campers vanished, counselors were found wandering the woods with blank expressions and empty eyes, and after that summer, no one ever returned. It was October, and a group of college friends, Mike, Sarah, Ben, and Lisa, decided to visit the camp for Halloween. They had heard the stories, of course, about strange sightings, eerie noises, and shadows that moved when no one was there to cast them. But they were skeptics, more interested in a night of scares and laughs than in heeding the townspeople's warnings. Ignoring the locals' dire looks and whispered words, they drove out to the camp under the cover of darkness. They reached Camp Hollow Pines just as the sun dipped below the mountains, leaving only the faint glow of dusk. The camp was almost eerily intact, with rusted swings creaking in the wind and peeling cabins that leaned to one side as if the woods themselves had begun to reclaim them. The silence was thick, broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional hoot of an owl. As they walked through the camp, they stumbled upon a locked door at the main cabin, the place where counselors had once gathered to tell stories and warn each other of the camp's strange, whispered history. The lock looked old and rusty, and without much thought, Ben found a rock and broke it open. The door creaked, groaning as it swung inward, revealing a dark interior that smelled faintly of mildew and rot. They entered the cabin, their flashlights casting long, thin beams through the dust-filled air. Inside, they found remnants of the past, old camp gear, faded posters, and a stack of notebooks on the table. Curious, they opened one, flipping through the pages. The notebook appeared to be a journal written by a counselor named Tom. The entries started out normal, recounting the usual camp activities, but as they read on, they grew darker, filled with frantic scrawls and incoherent ramblings. It's watching. I hear it at night, scratching at the door. I don't know what it wants, but I feel it every time I close my eyes. Last night I saw it. Just a shadow, but its eyes, they were empty. The friends exchanged nervous glances, laughing it off, but feeling the weight of something unspoken creeping in. They put the journal down and decided to explore the rest of the camp. As they walked, a dense fog rolled in, settling over the camp like a shroud, dampening the light and muffling their voices. They reached the fire pit, where a pile of logs still lay stacked, untouched since the camp had closed. As they stood there, a strange feeling washed over them, a sense of being watched. Ben, ever the brave one, joked about calling out to whatever might be lurking in the trees, but Sarah grabbed his arm, a look of fear crossing her face. "Stop," she whispered. "Something isn't right here." But Ben shrugged her off and, grinning, called into the darkness. "If you're out there, come join us." For a moment, there was only silence, and then, faintly, they heard it. A sound, like footsteps moving slowly through the underbrush, coming closer. "Who's out there?" Ben shouted, but there was no response. Just the slow, deliberate steps growing louder and louder. The friends huddled together, flashlights flicking across the trees, but the fog seemed to swallow the light. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. Then, a low, guttural voice broke the quiet. "You shouldn't be here." Their blood ran cold, and they turned, scrambling to run back toward the car. But as they moved, they realized they were no longer in the same part of the camp. Somehow, the landscape had shifted. The trees were different, thicker, gnarled with twisted branches that seemed to reach for them, and the path they'd come from was gone. Panicking, they split up to search for an exit, each one calling the other's names, but the fog muffled their voices as though it absorbed sound itself. Sarah stumbled upon another cabin, one she hadn't seen before, with a cracked window and the same strange symbol carved into the door as in the counselor's journal, a spiral with what looked like a single watchful eye in its center. As she stepped closer, a hand shot out from the darkness within, pulling her inside. She screamed, but the sound vanished, swallowed by the thick walls and dense fog. Her friends, hearing nothing, kept running, unaware that Sarah was no longer with them. Inside the cabin, Sarah found herself staring into a pair of hollow eyes, deep and empty, set into a face that was somehow both familiar and entirely alien. The figure smiled, its face stretching unnaturally wide, as if it were a mask concealing something far darker. She tried to scream again, but her voice had deserted her, leaving her frozen, paralyzed as the figure reached out, tracing a finger along her face. "We're all alone here," it whispered, its voice barely more than a breath. "Just us and the others." Outside, Mike, Lisa, and Ben ran in circles, finding themselves at the same clearing, over and over again, as if trapped in a maze with invisible walls. Each time they returned to the fire pit, they found something different: a shoe, a scarf, a flashlight, each item damp with dew and covered in dirt. Slowly, they began to recognize the items as Sarah's. The fog thickened, and a chill crept into the air, icy and unforgiving. The friends clung to each other, calling Sarah's name, but only silence answered them. They felt it then, a presence just beyond their sight, shifting in the shadows, its eyes watching from somewhere just out of reach. And then, one by one, the lights on their flashlights began to die. First Ben's, then Lisa's, until only Mike's dim glow remained. In that weak beam, they saw it, just for a second. A face grinning from the darkness, eyes wide and hollow, mouth twisted into a grotesque, impossible smile. And just before the last light went out, they heard Sarah's voice, faint and desperate. "Help me, please." But when they called out, she didn't answer. They were alone. The townspeople found the car the next morning, still parked at the camp entrance, empty. The search party scoured the area, but there was no trace of the friends. Only the fog remained, swirling lazily over the camp as though hiding something it didn't want the world to see. A week later, someone found a notebook lying in the forest just outside the camp. The final entry, written in shaky handwriting, read, "It's here with us. It wants us to stay, to become part of the camp. We hear Sarah's voice, but I don't think it's her anymore. I think it's just using her. And now it's calling our names too." No one ever returned to Camp Hollow Pines. But sometimes, in October, when the fog rolls down the mountains, The townspeople swear they can hear voices whispering from the trees, calling out names with hollow, echoing voices. And if you listen closely, you'll hear one name in particular, over and over again, drifting on the breeze. Help me, please.